Hi, everybody. Oh my God, I love when I get an enthusiastic group hello. Did you practice that beforehand? Well, thank you. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark. I work here at the library, part of the team that brings you these events. So thank you so much for being here. And same to those who are watching online. We love you being with us virtually or in person, any way you can be. Tonight, I get to introduce Héctor Tobar, who's the author of Our Migrant Souls, a meditation on race and the meanings and myths of Latino, which, by the way, just yesterday won the 10th annual Kirkus Prize, so give it up for that. We didn't plan that we got to announce that, but I'm glad that we do. And Héctor is, of course, also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and novelist, and his full bio is available in your printed programs that you have here. If you're watching online, you can find the bio on the event listing. He's going to be in conversation with Alejandro Varela, who, among many other things, last year published his debut novel, The Town of Babylon, which was like immediately shortlisted for a National Book Award in fiction, which is pretty amazing. And his full bio is also in your programs and on the event listing, so I encourage you to check those out. Hector's book, if you didn't notice, is available for sale outside. And I very much encourage you to get a copy if you're able or haven't already. It is truly an incredible read, which is why we're so thrilled that he's here with us tonight to talk about it. And additionally, proceeds from your purchase go to benefit the New York Public Library, and he will be signing copies of the book on stage afterward. So get yours, and if you do want to get it signed, I believe the book signing line will be starting right over here afterwards. You can just come line up and meet Héctor and get your book signed. And, if you can't or, won't, you can, of course, check it out with your New York Public Library card, which I'm sure everyone in this room has, yes? No shaming needed for people who don't have library cards? I mean, you wouldn't, come into a library and not have a library card, right? All right. I mean, I trust you. You coordinated that hello. These are library card holders. Hector's book came out earlier this year, and we've actually been trying to book him for months, but the book is just too amazing and he's too busy, so we weren't able to have him join us until now. But it was worth the wait, and also it lets us round out our month of Hispanic Heritage Month programming with him, which we're thrilled to do. Although I should mention that tomorrow we actually have one last event for Hispanic Heritage Month that's going to be really fun. It's during the day, but skip work and come. 2 p.m. Here. Well, not in this room. It's going to be upstairs in the Center for Research in Humanities, which is kind of the mezzanine floor, the first floor up, and a fun little hallway there in the middle. And we're going to have the editor of a much beloved but sadly defunct Peruvian magazine called Etiqueta Negra. His name is Julio Villanueva Chang, and he's going to be speaking with a journalist whose name is Miguel Fernandez Flores, and they're going to try to put back together one last article that they could never finish for the magazine, which coincidentally is about a statue that broke, so lots of putting back together. But it's tomorrow at 2 p.m. It's on our website, and if you're around, please come. Meanwhile, at Live from NYPL, coming up in the next few weeks, we have so many good events, all of them free. You all have to come to every single one. We have Vauhini Vara speaking with Leslie Jameson about her new short story collection, Benjamin Balint talking about the life of Bruno Schultz with Joshua Cohen, Pam Zhang talking with Padma Lakshmi about her new novel. We have our annual Halloween costume contest, which is one of the most fun nights of the year. People are encouraged to come in literary-themed costumes, and then those are judged by Tim Gunn and some of our own librarians, so you have the fashion and the literary together. And then we love Tim Gunn so much, he's going to come back the next week and interview Mary Beard about her new book, which is the follow-up to SPQR. So go to nypl.org/live, check it all out. It's all free. You must be there. Hopefully you all got note cards when you walked in, yes? Good, those are for asking questions. Héctor would love to answer some of your questions, so write them down. Some of my colleagues will come by and pick them up, and we will make sure he gets to them. We love it when you write legibly. It makes our lives easier. We also love when you address your questions in the form of questions. And if you're watching online, put your question in the chat, email publicprograms@nypl.org. We will get those as well. Wherever you are, we always want to hear from you. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos. We are grateful for that support. We are very grateful that you're all here. And let's please welcome Alejandro Varela and Héctor Tobar.
Oh, hi. Welcome. So you wrote a book?
I did.
Wow, that's amazing.
And you read it.
I did. Well,
which is
yes,
always
I
a
read
miracle when someone reads your book. It's a wonderful thing.
Congratulations. It's an amazing book.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I was telling Héctor backstage that there were about a dozen times in the margins when I wrote same. I had the same feeling, and I felt as if, in a way, he was writing the book for me. So thanks for doing that. Mm-hmm. Before we get started or get into the conversation, I thought maybe we could start with the word. The word.
Yes.
I know you're not a massive fan of it as an identifier.
That's why it's in quotes.
That's why it's in quotes.
Yes.
And I'm also not a massive fan, but this isn't about me. So tell me, why? What's the hang up? Latin, by the way.
Yes, Latin is the word, or Latino, or Latinx, or Latine. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Alejandro, for agreeing to be my interlocutor. It's such a great honor to be sharing the stage with you, especially, and to be here at the New York Public Library, one of the highlights of my career as a writer, to come here to this incredible venue. And thank you all for coming out on a beautiful fall evening. So yes, this term, I think all terms feel inadequate to describe the complexity of the people that are attached to them. You know, white and black are obviously the most simple thing that you could say about somebody, right? As terms. And so Latino or Latinx, I mean, for starters, their origin is in this idea of Latin America. And I did not know this until I started researching my book, but that goes back to the Napoleonic Wars and the French invading Mexico in the 19th century and telling them, look, we're not really here as invaders because we're brother Latins.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, what follows is the Battle of Cinco de Mayo and the Mexicans kicking the French out and executing Maximilian and all that. But that idea of Latin America is taken up, especially by the Latin American elites. But what does that term do? It says, okay, we have these common linguistic roots. Our roots go back to Spain, to Hispania, right? And what that does is it only expresses our Europeanness. And you and I, and almost every Latinx person, we're just a mixture of so many things. Right. And this is just one more element of an erasure that's been going on for hundreds of years. We both have Spanish surnames, Varela, right, and Tobar. Mine's a town in Burgos, Spain that I've never been to, right? And those names, we have those names, even though maybe 40% of our ancestors are African or of African descent or indigenous descent. And you looking at modern Guatemalan history or modern Salvadoran or Colombian history, you see how those elements of our identity are erased. And so Latin to me is just, or Latino is just it's a simplification. At the same time, it's a very powerful term. It's a term of an alliance. You're Colombian, Salvadoran, I'm Guatemalteco, Angelino. I married a woman who is Mexican-American, Chicana. What do the three of us have in common? My wife, me, and you, well, we're all Latino.
Right.
And my two sons who are here, who are Guatemalan, Mexican, Chicano, Angelino Americans, well, they can just say, I'm a Latino. Right. And it's saying, oh, we have something intimate. There's some intimate connection between us. Right. So it's a double-edged sword to me. It's an expression of a very real kind of cultural yearning for power and in the face of racism and discrimination, but it's also an erasure. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. And would you agree that when people say Latino in this country or Latinx or Latin, they're really saying mestizo? They're often saying mestizo.
I think they're often saying mestizo. That's why you don't really hear Ted Cruz calling himself a Latino because he doesn't, or who's the guy from Florida, Marco Rubio, they're not really big into their latinidad because there is an element of, especially when people think of Latino people, they think, I think, of that cultural mixing that makes you part of these other people
Right,
who are outside of the mainstream of Anglo-American history.
Yeah.
Even though we also have our own relationship with whiteness, but that's another story.
Yeah. So the title of the subtitle of the book is A Meditation on Race and the Meanings and Myths of Latino. It really does feel like a meditation. Reading it throughout, we let us sit with these concepts and ideas. We tackle them from different angles and different places. And at times it reads also like an ethnography. I was telling you that it reminded me a little bit of Travels with Charlie, the Steinbeck book, because of the road trip that you take and you interview lots of people. And the thing that changes over time is the journey here. At first, it's empire, 3 empires, and then the border moves. And then there's a period in the 1960s and 70s where it gets sort of somewhat easier to come here. My parents, my aunts and uncles in Colombia and El Salvador, they went to apply for visas to visit the United States, and the embassy was like, "Do you want a green card?" And they're like, "You could just come live here." So this is late 60s, early 70s. Very different from the sort of harrowing journey that has become, the staple of CNN. And so, and other cable
Fox
news networks,
News,
Fox
yeah.
News, all of them.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, I feel like no immigrant group sort of is tied to their journey the way Latin Americans are in this country. It's sort of like, it's such a part of who they are.
Right.
And I've wondered, when I see or read about depictions of Ellis Island, there's always that sort of huddled masses yearning motif going, and there's empathy. Well, I don't feel like that same grace is extended.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that the empathy that you're remembering, this
Yeah.
sort of like romanticized image of Ellis Island and this period of massive immigration from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, that's something that came 50 years after that immigration took place, right? And so, in 1924, this country passes an immigration reform law designed to limit the number of Italians and Jews and Russians and Greeks, because the country was becoming too swarthy. I mean, this was, they actually established quotas that were meant to preserve the racial balance of the United States. And this is in the 1920s. So what we experienced later in the 20th century, this idea of like, oh, they just came through Ellis Island and what a wonder if they came the right way and all that stuff.
Right.
That's a romanization that comes many years later. So we are caught up in this moment in which, our extended families, we have someone who decided they want to come from Bogota or from, Guatemala City or wherever to the United States, and then they're caught up in this whole immigration drama, this performance,
Right.
and that is what racializes us.
Right.
We were supposed to blend into whiteness. We were supposed to be the next Italians. That's what Latino was supposed to be, and yet, and that doesn't happen because now in the modern American discourse, Fox News especially has racialized us. I mean, I don't even watch Fox News, but when I'm on a plane, people have it on their screens,
Right.
and I can see what they're doing. Iranians and Salvadorans at the border. It's like, it's just, and so that racialization of us, which goes from not just cable television, but film, cartel representations, all of this sort of mythology about the danger of the border, that danger is meant to create a story that says that we shouldn't be here because we're changing the look of the country.
Do you then see some possibility for the narrative changing with time? Will we romanticize this period then?
Well, I say in my book that one day maybe they'll build a Statue of Liberty in San Isidro,
Right.
And those open fields that hundreds of thousands of people walked across when the border was more open between San Isidro and Tijuana, San Diego and Tijuana. I mean, a whole bunch of us have roots connected to that place, or to the Rio Grande Valley, on the river in the Rio Grande Valley, or to the the detention centers outside of all the major cities of the Southwest.
Yeah.
There should be, one day there will be memorials. I think absolutely that will happen. The question is for me, will it happen in 20 years or 100? Right. Because right now it just seems to be so rooted. This idea of the danger of the border is so rooted in the nation's psyche.
Yeah. So you came here, or your parents came here after the coup in Guatemala. You write about that, and I think there are 3 countries in the entire world that the U.S. doesn't have a military base in or hasn't invaded at some point. I looked it up, actually. There are 3. One is Liechtenstein, and I can't remember the other 2. But you also can find it online. And so I was reminded that all of Latin America has some sort of history of U.S. involvement, either finding their way into natural resources or coups or destabilization in some way, shape, or form. What a strange thing it is to leave one's country to go to the place that caused the chaos that made you leave in the first place. No?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it just goes so deep. My mother and father, like your parents, they came on a regular commercial airplane with tourist visas.
Right.
And my father and mother landed at LA International Airport when it was brand new. And I've written a lot about that moment. And only recently in doing research, did I realize that the Mustang planes that bombed Guatemala in 1954 were made in a factory on the edge of LA International Airport. So my father, who had been bombed by these Mustang airplanes, he was 12 years old in 1954. He remembers the coup. The CIA had this coup against the democratically elected government in Guatemala. My father was 12 years old, and he hid under a bed as they're bombing Guatemala City. He arrives in Los Angeles as a 20-year-old, and he's arriving at a place where they made these planes. And there's just thousands of ways. That's just in which the history of our families are tied to these stories of empire building. There's just so many ways. I think every family has a story like that.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that this context, to no one's surprise, is missing from the conversation, right?
Well, and it's part of our national psyche.
Right.
You're Salvadoran and Colombian. I mean, it's like El Salvador.
Right.
I mean, the history of El Salvador, an incredible drama. Like the peasantry and the working class create this improvised army that takes on an U.S.-backed military regime, and they basically fought them to a tie, right? And forced the Salvadoran government to sit down peace talks. And it's just an incredible dramatic moment that I wrote a book about the Salvadoran Revolution, my last novel, The Last Great Road Bum. And people don't know that story. Salvadoran kids, they don't grow up with that story, and they think of it as just as some craziness that's in their parents' heads. Right. Right. And so to me, the fact that that's not in the curriculum, that should be in the curriculum. And it will one day, it will be.
Right. It seems it should also accompany the news coverage, right? Because if you have images of cages and caravans and gangs, but you don't understand why they are or why they exist, right? That is the sociopolitical context that's missing.
Right. But it wouldn't be the performance that it is anymore.
Right.
And the idea of it is for it to be this performance that creates this sense of chaos, and that erases all of the complications and all of the humanity of people. Yeah. Even the liberal coverage, it shows people as innocents caught up, with glaring headlights in their eyes as they're trying to cross, and no sense of geography of the United States. And it's just like, it's not true. Yeah. People, yes, it's wrong that people are harassed, at the border. It's wrong that they die crossing the border, but that they are not helpless. Right. And it's impossible to have that discussion. It's impossible to make that drama, part of the American story, because our stories are weaponized. And so we have to, the story of the immigrant crosser becomes a weapon in a really life and death discussion. So we're prevented from being who we are fully in the American imagination.
You don't only write about struggle, you also write about hope and possibility and utopia. Yes. And so in addition to talking about Latin Americans, you also talk about Black Americans, Asian Americans, the struggles they faced. And it suggests a universality of experience, not a symmetry, not a, right? But a common thread, something. And what I got from that and from the stories in the book are that there is a collective struggle. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the importance of that collectivity or solidarity across the movements, of the various movements.
Well, I think, first of all, to me, it's not like a romantic vision. It's just the reality of who we are as residents of this country, residents of a city like New York or Los Angeles, where just stories are naturally being woven together. You know, I mean, I think, you know, you think of your typical, oh my God, you know, I mean, I was in Spanish Harlem for this book, and just the incredible variety of people, Guatemaltecos, Puerto Ricanos, African Americans. You know, I did not realize until I studied the history of Spanish Harlem and talked to people there, how much affinity there is between African American struggle and Puerto Rican struggle and respect. That's one of the reasons why, you know, the Puerto Rican barrios of New York vote so heavily Democratic, is because there's this long history that goes back to Puerto Rico itself and the kind of racial makeup of Puerto Rico and the racial identity that floats through so many Puerto Rican families. Yeah. So, you know, myself, growing up in Los Angeles, I grew up alongside Filipino kids and Jewish kids, Eastern European kids. And so I think that history is interwoven in so many ways. Yeah. And that really, to understand it, you really need to speak several languages. You need to be conversant. To me, you can't understand a city like Los Angeles, and even as Latino history, without understanding African American history. And I spent my whole life, you know, getting little bits and pieces of African American history everywhere I can, because I feel like it's essential. And I was taught that from a very early age. My father at age 5 was telling me about Martin Luther King, you know, and all these things. So I think that that it's very important to build a practice of mutual respect and curiosity. I desperately want Latino kids to understand African American struggle. I want them to understand Reconstruction, the Reconstruction amendments, this incredible edifice of civil rights that we have in this country, which many other groups have used to defend their rights, and understand the way those stories are intertwined on a big level and also very much on an intimate level. Yeah. Every week, I get an email from someone who's Blaxican. So, Mr. Tobar, I found in your book, I saw this term for the first time, and I started looking, do you have any more books I can read on being Blaxican? Because I'm Blaxican, you know? And so, you know, but because we think of these histories as being separate, you think you're broken if your two groups collide to make you, right. You know, and that is just, to me, we're all mixed in one way or another. So I think it's important to have that. I think is the beginning of a discourse, and especially we have to think that way about white itself. Yeah. Which is part of what my book is about too. Yeah. And you know, it's about seeing into whiteness and what's going on with whiteness, and you know, and so that's also a big part of what I think the discussion should be. And
I would like maybe for you to share a little bit in a moment about your infamous neighbor. You mentioned Martin Luther King, and but before we get there, I want to say that I wonder how the tension or the apolitical nature that can result from fleeing conflict, right? You leave something to be involved in politics, to sign a petition, to show up at a rally in a country where there is political repression. Then you come to a new country and you decide, we're not talking about that. We're never going to bring it up. And your kids are curious, and what's racism and what's that? And they're like, nope, put your head down, go to work. Los americanos son un poquito ignorantes, ignóralos, it's okay. Just keep going, which I believe probably makes it harder, or can make it more difficult, to have that political awakening and to build those bridges that you're talking about.
Well, yeah, I think that parents who do that are trying to protect their children.
Right.
They're trying to protect them from the trauma, many times unresolved trauma. And it's part of a whole strategy that is so present in our communities, and I think you're aware of it too, of just of erasing unpleasantness, of thinking, embracing that idea of reinventing yourself, and just putting in a closet so much of what's happened to us. So what happens is that, I mean, I teach at a University of California, and my students, you know, they're 18, 19, 20 years old. And it's like, and they start to realize, hold on a second, there's a story there that I need to find out. And so they write about these initial attempts to get their father, their mother, their aunt to talk about these traumatic things, which aren't always they're not just about politics. They're about, you know, we were the other family. right? We were the other family, and my father had this other family, and they were richer or whatever. Or, I was the lighter one, and that was the dark one. All these issues that have been buried. And we're just really, expert at hiding things. And we learn these ways of hiding things and not talking about them. And so it's politics, and it's also these intimate sort of secret spaces that very often, to me, are rooted in the traumas of poverty. Yeah. In the traumas of poverty.
Yeah.
And poverty, often poor people fight back.
Yeah.
And they are exposed to violence. Right. And a lot of that is buried.
Yeah. You talk a little bit about how a perceived lack of opportunity and poverty, and even maybe possibly a lack of opportunity affected your neighbor, the infamous one.
Yes. Yeah, so I realized, because I'm a huge history buff, and I read, maybe in the 90s, I read Gerald Posner's book about the assassination of Martin Luther King called Killing the Dream. And I read about, he reconstructed James Earl Ray's travels as he plotted the assassination of Martin Luther King. And I realized at one point there was the address of the guy's house, and I took out a map book of his apartment, and it was right next to where I lived in the same year. And and then I did further investigation, and it was like he was right behind the wall of our backyard. That was James Earl Ray's apartment. And so this white supremacist, and then I looked at his biography, because evil is evil, yes, but I think it's really important to understand, the complexity of the evil racist person. And so his family had this incredible history of being essentially, the poorest white people in the Midwest. I'm very proud of, one of the few pieces of totally original research was that I went through the census records of the town, Altoona, Illinois, I believe it is, where James Earl Ray was born. And, after a while, they're unsealed so you can see the names of where people lived. And he was born on a street with black people. And so his family had grown up, his family were so, and that was the ultimate stigma for a poor white person, is to grow up among people of color. And there was also European immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, Irish immigrants. And so here's a person who has this hurt and this pain of poverty, and who translates it into an ideology to make sense of it, and that's to hate the people around him, right? And that's what James Earl Ray had his whole life, and he was a student of it. I mean, he studied the history of Rhodesia. He wanted to move to Rhodesia, right. Which was then a white-run country in Africa. And then I thought about my father's story. My father, an intellectually curious person from also a very poor background, shoeless, grown up shoeless in Guatemala. And so these two poor men come to the same neighborhood, a neighborhood of transients, like many neighborhoods in American cities, right? A neighborhood where poor people come to reinvent themselves, and who else comes? And it's a funny thing. It's my mother is pregnant with me in the same neighborhood in Hollywood, and she gets a knock on the door, and it's this African American guy who's studying Spanish at LA City College. His name is Booker Wade, and he tells her, because he's practicing his Spanish, look, señorita, if you need a ride to the hospital, I can give you a ride to the hospital. He gives my mother a ride to the hospital in his convertible on a winter night in February, and later agrees to be my godfather. He was my godfather at my baptism. Who is Booker Wade? He is an NAACP activist who was arrested in the Memphis Public Library because it was segregated, and he went in it to desegregate it and was arrested. And his mother got really afraid because the Memphis police drove him around in the paddy wagon around Memphis, threatening him, telling him he was going to be the next Emmett Till. And so she put him on the next bus for Los Angeles. And so this civil rights activist and this white supremacist are just come into the life of this Guatemalan kid. And to me, that's that's American history. And I think that a lot of us, a lot of Latino kids are growing up around this incredibly rich history. And I think it's, kids in Pennsylvania are growing up in towns where, Frederick Douglass and James and John Brown passed through, trying to start a slave uprising. There's all kinds of crazy overlapping that I think it just really helps us understand where we stand in the world.
Okay. I'd be remiss as a public health worker not to ask you about community and social support. So you talk of, there's several examples of the families and the people that you interview who were upwardly mobile, who climbed the ladder, who have successes and businesses. And I'm curious about the cost of that. I'm curious about moving out of red line districts, into the nicer neighborhoods, which you talk about in LA, moving out of the city towards the suburbs. What happens when you are the one Salvadorian family on the block of an affluent white neighborhood? You know, what's lost when you move away from community?
Well, I was one of those kids, you know,
me too.
and I was separated from, well, first of all, being a son of an immigrant, you're separated from your extended family. So I didn't grow up with my aunts and uncles and my grandparents. They were, you know, they were in another country. And so you're separated from a kind of rootedness. And we're taught to sort of embrace this idea of meritocracy. And to me, that is really insidious because it places us in this world where roots don't matter, family doesn't matter, what matters is ambition. And I think that it's ultimately a self-defeating journey. You know, yes, there is also this sort of ethnic and racial tension that takes place in the suburbs. You know, oh my God, high school, junior high school, you know, and for my students, so many stories of going to schools that are integrated and being one of a few Latino students. And that's just a tough road. Yeah. You have to have character, and most kids do. You know, I think most kids most young people find a way through it. So yes, it's this journey that has many psychic costs to it. And very often, young people find themselves later, get to college, and trying to sort of put together what happened to them. I can't tell you how many stories I've read of exactly the way you describe, of young people moving from the barrio to a nicer suburb and just having it be this experience of erasure and disorientation.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And can come with, socioeconomic status, right? It can come with that, but there are ramifications long term to that sort of experience.
Yeah, and I write in my book, I've always been kind of a radical, sorry. But I think that just the recent years have led me to believe that all of our discourse about race and these ideas about race, underneath them, there are these systems of exploitation and that are unsustainable. And now in our lifetimes, we're seeing how unsustainable they are. I mean, because the planet, right, is a living thing that is going to be killed because of the way we live. And also because, oh my God, it's impossible to live in many American cities for your average working family. Right. And I think that we really need to build alliances across these barriers. We need poor Appalachian people to be in discussion with African-American activists in Detroit, which has actually happened before, by the way. We need those kinds of alliances to take place in order for us to move forward. I just think, I think that at the root of all of this discussion of race and racism and discrimination, there is an economic system that produces inequality. In fact, that's part of the idea of the book, is that all of these labels have been created in order to explain inequality. Why is it that a certain kind of person is the person who's always cleaning up in the back of the restaurants? Yeah. You know, why is it that the last 2 days I've been in a Thai restaurant, a Japanese restaurant, and a bagel place, and all three of them had Mexican music playing in the back. Yeah. You know, okay, well, how do we explain that? Well, that's because those are hardworking people and they're not educated, you know, and it's like this whole, racializing Latino people is a way of explaining this system. But at the root of it, there are these inequalities that we really need to talk about. And that we don't, there isn't. And that's why they've managed to split white working people from, so-called white working people from Latino and Black and other working peoples. That's part of the strategy. That's a strategy that goes back in the United States, to the 19th century.
Yeah, you talk a lot about this divide and conquer tactic, and you say you envision a possibility in a kind of a post-racial society where we run out of groups and we start racializing the homeless or
Yes,
the unhoused,
absolutely.
as you say, right?
Yes.
Which
Yes.
is fascinating.
I can just, because what it means to racialize someone is you say, oh, they're that way because that's inherent in them. That's just the way they are.
Right.
And so today in I don't know, I mean, I know it's bad in New York, but it's much worse in Los Angeles, just the quantity of unhoused people. And in fact, even using that euphemism, unhoused, is a form of acceptance. So it's kind of like saying, oh, homeless, well, homeless, it's not, it's like there's always going to be homeless people, so let's not call them something that's kind of an insult. Let's have a nice name for it. So to me, there's a kind of liberal acceptance in that. And to me, I remember a society without homeless people. I can remember, I grew up in the 1960s. I can remember, you know, it was just a very, very few small population of people who were unhoused. And so, yes, I think that new kinds of racialization, I mean, the terms we carry are always shifting. And we just can't see it because we sort of so locked in the present.
I want to talk about stress for a moment, my
Yes.
favorite topic. You share this sort of poignant anecdote about a father who recounts having raised his family here, successful kids, they went to college, I believe this is the one. And then he says that one of the things he's most proud of is that he never hit his children.
Yes.
Which I thought was really touching, and it made me think, a few times in the book you talk about forgiveness, about the younger generation forgiving the older generation, understanding that they were sort of under unique pressures.
Absolutely.
And, you know, sort of holding them to a different standard in a way. And it takes a lot for someone who has been hurt to blame the system and not the person, right? It takes a lot of integrity and maturity to be able to reach that point. And I wonder how important you think forgiveness is in this context.
Wow. I think that, yes, forgiveness is, you can't achieve forgiveness unless you have understanding, unless you take the time to see that person who's the center of your life, who has hurt you in some way, and understand them as a human being. I mean, this is something I learned from my therapist. You know, it's like, you're angry at your mother now, Hector, but one day you will have compassion for her. And, you know, and it happened eventually, you know? I mean, it happened. And I saw her for who she was. Oh my God, a woman who got pregnant when she was 19 and full of life and so intelligent and, you know, in love with this man who was in love with her briefly and then wasn't anymore, and then in a new country. And yes, I mean, you know, a little vain, but so am I. You know, I mean, here I am on stage writing books with my name on it, right? I mean, you know, and so, yeah, I think that is, it's like taking the time to be in the space of the generational journey. Yeah. You know, and I think that's something that's helped me a lot. And it's something that I was being my own therapist when I was reading history like crazy. You know, it's like even before the idea of Latino existed, my father would come home, he was taking night school classes to get his high school equivalency. He comes home with his history textbook. Wow, look at this stuff, slavery, you know, the pilgrims and all this crazy. It's like, there's something there that explains who I am. Yeah. You know, and I think that all of us are trying to put together this story because we want to have compassion. It's very important to have anger. It's important to have anger and to point out injustice, to question patriarchy, to question homophobia. Yes, absolutely. That has to be questioned, and it takes conflict. It's kind of hard for me because I kind of run away from conflict all the time. But sometimes you have to get in people's faces. There has to be that conflict, absolutely. And I see this taking place all the time among the young people who I teach. You know, telling me stories, their coming out stories. I came, you know, and fighting with their father, or then, you know, or unexpectedly getting embraced by their mother. Who, I thought you were going to hate me. No, Mika, how could you think that because of that I wouldn't love you? Or, and other times it's like, get out of my house, you know? Yeah. And so it's like, so they're doing that. People are really confronting that, and it's absolutely necessary. And it's a lifelong journey. Yeah. You know, I'm so lucky that, you know, my two sons who are here in the front row have taught me so many lessons about, you know, about myself and about themselves and the generation. My daughter, who's not here, she's in Rhode Island in college. You know, she came out essentially at 15, and I really learned. I mean, I started reading, and I'm lucky that your coming out happens during this incredible explosion of ideas and thought about what it means to be queer and the way, and homophobia in this country. And I looked at my entire history differently thanks to her and thanks to all those activists. And, and it's a constant, and that's the final chapter is dedicated to these young Latinx, undocumented, very often undocumented young people who've taken up Celia Cruz as a symbol and other symbols and questioned all these sort of patriarchal ideas that are so much a part of our culture, right? So I think to me it's a constant process, and I'm very fortunate to have 3 young, incredibly amazing thinkers and assertive young people in my own family to constantly remind me. And they help me so much with my book, even without knowing it, because I showed an early chapter to one of my sons, and he said, maybe the tone isn't quite exactly right. And I changed the tone in this opening chapter. I learned to be more respectful towards this younger generation that I was writing to. So, I think you always have to constantly be listening and learning from the stories around you.
In fact, the structure and the voice of the book are pretty unique. It's not very common to read something that's written so intimately. And you use a lot of we and us. And the through line, I think, through the book are the conversations you have with your students and how they influenced you.
Yes.
And I wonder how you arrived at that. Did you know from the beginning that this was going to be a book that sort of chronicled your relationship with your students and what they brought to the table?
I think that the germ of that, the very beginning, was the voice of James Baldwin in my head. And I'm in New York, and I'm in the public library, which figured so importantly in the life of James Baldwin. So, St. James, here I am. Thank you for looking after me in my journey. And of course, I read The Fire Next Time in my 50s for the first time. And especially that prologue, where he's writing to his nephew, and it's 1960-something, and there's all these horrible things happening in America. And James Baldwin writes with this incredible love towards his nephew and wanting to protect him with ideas. Ideas can protect us. And I just thought, and then, we were stuck in the pandemic, and I watched that beautiful Raoul Peck, I Am Not Your Negro documentary over and over again, which is this incredible, the cadences read by Samuel Jackson of, James Baldwin's prose. And I thought, I want to do that because my people are living this moment. We're living this moment. And so, yes, that's where that started. It started with James Baldwin in my head and wanting to send a message from all of my years of trying to be a writer. James Baldwin had gone through, when he wrote The Fire Next Time, he'd already gone through a journey of writing several novels, his own sort of coming out, his battles with American literature to have his story sort of be respected, and his, all of his journey, having to go to France, to sort of feel liberated, and all the things that he did. And I feel like I'm in a similar state in my career. I've written, this is my 6th book, and having dedicated a career, which I really only started trying to write books when I turned 30. So, and just all those years of trying to do that, 3 decades now, and just wanting to share that as a fellow traveler, as a fellow, resident of this beautiful and troubled country.
I think we have some audience questions now. Ooh,
Thank you.
I'm going to vet on the spot. All right. Okay. All right. As a progressive Latinx, I say Latinx instead of Latinx because Latinx sounds like an over-the-counter medication. Latinx has some oomph to it. As a progressive Latinx witnessing the rise of the alt-right, too often led by Latinx men, I'm worried that even if Latinx do not increasingly identify as white, they might still ally themselves with white supremacy. What forces do you see rising against white supremacist ideas among Latinx folks or Latinx, and how can we bolster those forces?
Wow, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, I think that part of it is understanding that the idea of being Latino has always included this pull towards whiteness. You know, both of my parents are listed on my birth certificate because back then in LA County, they put race on the birth certificate. They're listed as Caucasian, which is kind of interesting. My mother's very light, but my father is definitely not. And I don't think he was there. But even if he had been, they wouldn't have known what to put down. It's like it was Caucasian and black and, Japanese and Chinese or whatever, right? And so I think that that's part of what's out there. But I think that really in the root of this idea of latinidad, there is a notion of class, of social class. And that's something we don't talk about in this country, social class. So I think that our perception for most of us of latinidad is tied to work. Even if we are professionals and we've become middle class, we know there's someone in our family who started off laboring, and we respect that because we haven't bought into this notion that you're somehow flawed if you're a worker or you're poor. Because I taught in Oregon, and I had a lot of 90% white kids, and they we'd have this discussion, and it's like, no, if you're poor in Oregon, it's because you did something wrong. You're a poor white person because you failed. Whereas if you're a poor Latino person, you have this idea of like, oh, well, my people have come here to struggle, and we've come to change, and we're really hardworking, So I think this idea of class is really part of the reason why, generally speaking, as a group, not everyone, but generally speaking, there is this sense of solidarity with people of color and generally, especially with African American struggle. There is this, this sense of resistance to nationalistic and racist and white supremacist discourse. Right. It's because we have a sense of class solidarity with each other.
And though we still have within Latinidad a lot of racism, right?
Oh,
a lot of
100%.
Right.
In my own family, I've seen this. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you both for tonight. You're welcome. I am writing a term paper for my political science class on racism, overall treatment of Puerto Ricans by the U.S. government, and the treatment of Puerto Rican women being used as experiments for birth control, having forced hysterectomies. I was wondering, do you have any books you'd recommend? Thank you.
Well, it just so happens that my partner, Virginia Espino, wrote a film, did a documentary called No Más Bebés about a very similar case in Los Angeles County. And she interviewed, it was her dissertation, and then later she and the filmmaker Renee Tajima Peña did this film together, and they interviewed these women who had been sterilized in the 1960s and 70s. And at the root of this practice in the public hospitals was the idea that we needed to control population. So people thought, well, you're a public health person, right? They thought that they were doing a social good by having these women, and they would be giving birth, and they would cut their tubes while they were giving birth, and force them to sign these consent forms, or pressure them to sign these consent forms. So I would say yes, look into eugenic sterilization and the now very increasingly robust literature on eugenic sterilization in the United States. There is a lot out there, and obviously, I would study racial ideas in Puerto Rico and how that's fit in with American history. I know that darker skinned Puerto Rican soldiers in World War II were put into all black units, and lighter skinned were put into white units. Right. So it's a very rich and complex history. It's not my particular field of study, but like I say, I really recommend my compañera's documentary, No Más Bebés.
One of my favorite parts of this book is the introduction. It's it's beautifully succinct and a human way to get us thinking about our stories. How do touch points with young people, like teaching, impact your writing?
Well, like I said, I just think that, college professors are kind of a strange group, and you go into an English department, they don't like to read, or they don't like to write. They can't write. No, I think that the problem is not that college students can't write. It's that they don't want to write the way that their professors are teaching them to write, And so to me, just finding so much curiosity and finding so much willingness to engage in self-exploration. To me, that to me has been one of the greatest gifts of this latter part of my career, because I basically went into academia because I wanted to write novels and write books, and it was kind of this soft landing, leaving the newspaper business, which is crazy corporate America, takeovers and buyouts and everything. And, I thought, I'm going to go and, teaching will be the second thing. But no, teaching has been like just a daily lesson. It's a daily lesson. It's a lesson too, like I've seen now I've been doing this for 10 years, how slang changes so quickly. Every year I ask my students for the, hey, how do you say marijuana? And there's like all these sort of, every year it sort of changes, and, or for sex. No, but like when I first started teaching, people use like Netflix and chill. And now it's like, what? What's that? And so, yeah. And so all of these crazy things. So what I'm saying is that...
Not where I thought we were going.
I know.
Okay?
Is that there is this incredible richness of language and ideas in the experience of young people that is, as we say in Spanish, menospreciado. It's devalued. And it's like, if you read Shakespeare's full of sex jokes, right? And that's why it's so hard to read, is because the sex jokes are like, they were already old in 1710, never mind now, right? And so I tell my students, look, you're sitting on top of this incredible, resource of language. You can write for me in Spanish. You can write for me in Spanglish. You can write for me. You can write cuss words. I want to hear it all, And so it's like, oh my God, it's like what I'm not seeing on television. It's like that crazy Netflix series about this really complicated Mexican-American family. And, it's like, it's not on my TV, but it's in the student papers. And that to me is like, I feel like I'm looking at the future of American literature. I'm getting scenes from like the crazy Tennessee Williams play about the alcoholic Mexican father, It's like, and that's like, we can't do that now because we don't want to see that, right? Because of representation. But it's a reality, that people want, and that comes out, and it's like, it's on the page. So it's like, I'm looking into the future. That's how I feel when I sit with my students, because it takes a long time to make a writer.
You talk a little bit in the book about the pressure of presenting marginalized and oppressed characters or subjects as almost, perfect, because we don't want to contribute to their vilification. And if we show all three sides or all three dimensions, it's problematic. But then it's an incomplete picture, right?
Right, and it's something like think about it. I don't know what young people are reading in high school. I mean, but I know they're not reading Luis Alfaro plays. Luis Alfaro, great Mexican-American playwright from central Los Angeles, writes about all these crazy, Mexican-American families that he kind of grew up with. But if that were part of like on the streaming all the time, if there were like 10 different Luis Alfaros who were like on 10 different streaming channels, all those Mexican-American and Latino kids growing up would say, oh, I'm not that strange. Right. And instead that's not there, so they think they're broken. Right. Like something's wrong with them. Yeah. And and so that to me is what that's to me it's hurtful to see that people don't see themselves the complexity represented.
Do your students know they appear in the book, and how have they reacted to it?
Yeah, I mean, several of them do. I had the great privilege. I have a student who's from New York and California. He's Mexican Dominican, which is a thing. There's a lot of Mexican Dominican kids. There must be tons in New York. Yeah. And I read the passage about him to him. I said, dude, this is, and he's like, wow, he was really moved. But I could also tell, like, he was thinking he's a really good writer. That's okay, but I'm more of a badass than you are. It's like, and it's like, wow, it's like, I mean, he was really honored, but he really and I could just sort of feel his story. He's like, yeah, you're doing it now. I want to do it too. That kind of thing. And also it was assigned to, one of the first people to assign it in their class was one of my colleagues. And she sent me back the student comments. And she said, yeah, I read all these stories that we shared with Professor Tobar, and it was really nice because it's really nice to know that he was actually reading them. He was reading our papers.
Wow.
And I mean, hasta nivel está, at that level, people don't, they don't think of their stories as worthy to be read, or they just think that I, assign grades or something. But no, he was really reading them, so that was nice. Yeah.
Wait, are there any more questions?
So I'm Cuban.
Cubana.
And came from Cuba to United States 61. And you just jolted my memory, so I just want to say three things. The first thing is I grew up, my grandmother always said, mejora la raza.
Yes.
Improve the race.
Right.
Like if I could bring home a Latino, improve the race.
Yes.
An American. So that was one thing. Another thing was, if I said I'm an immigrant, they would almost slap me. They would say,
Wow.
political exile. Political exiles.
Wow.
Because we were better than an immigrant.
Right.
We were political exiles. And then you said something, it's something I've never thought about. We Latinos, we grow up and it's a violent household because
Yes.
that's the way that, if they didn't go to therapy, their therapy was beating us.
Right.
And my grandmother beat the shit out of me more than anybody. They all did. And by the way, she's the one I miss the most, right? And I never beat my daughter, and I have such pride about that. And if I
Yeah.
tell somebody I never beat my daughter, they would say, "Well, so what?" But for me, it's so I have pride. I never beat her, even though I was upset, and I just thought that's how we.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And for the audience listening, our questioner here was talking about many things about how there is this idea of bettering the race if you marry into a lighter family, which of course, is tied up to all these ideas of what beauty and intelligence are. And that's not just a Latino thing. Many different groups of people of color have those ideas. Yes. And the idea too of that you were talking about being a survivor of domestic violence and witnessing that, and not wanting to carry that. And I think that part of our journey as people of Latin descent, or whatever you want to call us, mestizos or whatever, is that it's a journey in which we are constantly trying to defend our own humanity and to reach a level of humanity that's been denied to us, right? In my family, the thing that I read about in my book is that my father did not tell me that his mother was illiterate. And there's lots of Latino families where there are older women especially who are illiterate because they were denied education. Because women very often are denied, young girls are denied education. And so that was this stigma. And then I didn't realize that when he was putting books all around me when I was a kid and taking pictures of me with books and globes and encyclopedias, buying me a dictionary as like my first present, he was kind of sending me a message about language and a journey into humanity. So yes, thank you. Thank you for your question.
Okay. I think we are at time. So thank you, Hector. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
And there will be a signing
Yes, I
here.
will sign books right here. Yes.
So bring them
So
up.
if you want to buy a book, I guess they're for sale, and I will sign them. And thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you.
You have them in the library.
I assume, yes, they have.